Biden administration announced that it was approving a $36 billion bailout for the Teamsters' underfunded pension. There are about 350,000 retirees that are drawing benefits from this pension, and that amounts to better than $100,000 per person. Now, this should infuriate so many Americans who don't even have pensions. In fact, a lot of Americans earned a lot less than the Teamsters and have no pensions. Why should they be forced to subsidize the overly generous pensions of overpaid Teamsters? One of the ways you know that they were overpaid was that they didn't contribute enough into their pensions. They were promised a pension where the benefits far exceeded anything they contributed. So they were able to enjoy higher wages because enough money wasn't deducted from their pay to meet the obligations that they expected from their pensions, and the American taxpayer should not be on the hook to make up that shortfall. What should happen is that either current retirees should accept reduced benefits, or current workers should be making higher contributions into that pension so that the people who are retired can get their money, or the companies themselves that made commitments to their workers should have to dig into their own pockets and make the additional contributions into the pension. The losses should not be shifted to taxpayers, and more specifically, not taxpayers, because nobody's taxes are being raised. All the money to bail out the Teamsters pension is just going to be created out of thin air. It's just more debt that's going to be monetized, so it's more inflation, so every American will end up paying. But these losses should not be borne by the entire American population, because most Americans did not benefit from this pension. That each Teamster is effectively being given $100,000. That amounts to a massive welfare payment being distributed to a small group of Americans, paid for by the entire population. Now, a lot of people would say that it's not fair if the Teamsters have to suffer a reduction in their pension. Well, sure, life isn't fair. But what's a lot more unfair is forcing other Americans who don't even have pensions to pay so that the Teamsters can have even larger pensions than what they're actually entitled to based on the amount of money that they've actually contributed into their pensions and the returns that those pensions have actually generated. If you're going to bail out the Teamsters' pensions, you might as well bail out everybody's pension. In fact, it wouldn't be fair to only bail out the Teamsters and not everybody else. And what about all the people who don't have pensions at all? Maybe the government should give everybody some money to make up for the fact that they don't have pensions. Not only is this whole thing unfair and clearly unconstitutional, there's nothing in the Constitution that authorizes the U.S. government to bail out anybody's pension, but it also creates an incredible moral hazard. It sends the wrong message that you don't have to fund your pension. You can promise benefits you can't deliver, because when the money's not there, the government's just going to make up the difference. What we need is to hold Teamsters' pension accountable for this loss, because the administrators of these pensions need to act responsibly. If they're not generating enough returns in the pensions to meet the obligations, they have to increase the contributions or they have to cut the benefits. They can't just do nothing, but now they can do nothing because the government is going to bail them out. And of course, one of the ironies behind why some of these pensions are so underfunded is because they couldn't earn any interest on their bonds, because the Federal Reserve kept interest rates at zero. Because nobody can get an adequate return on bonds, a lot of these pensions took on a lot of risk by investing in overpriced stocks. And now that the market is coming down, the pensions are underfunded and they don't have enough money to meet their obligations. And this deficit is going to get larger as the bear market continues. I think a lot of these pensions invested in the high-flying stocks that have come down the most and still have the most downside because they were forced to gamble to make up for the money that they can no longer earn on conservative investments because the Fed kept interest rates so low. So the government created the problem with artificially low interest rates and turning the stock market into a casino, and now it's exacerbating the problem by creating a moral hazard by rewarding the failed pensions and sending messages to everybody else. There's no reason to act responsibly. You don't have to ask workers to contribute more or accept less. You don't even have to ask employers to increase the contributions to the pensions. We're just going to wait for a government bailout. As a result of this, the problem gets much worse. The number of underfunded pensions will increase, as will the size of the gap, which means the size of the bailout will be that much larger, which means even more money will be printed to fund it, which means everybody suffers even higher inflation. Also, part of the fraud of this entire bailout is that the money to pay for it is coming from the COVID relief money. What does this have to do with COVID? These pensions aren't underfunded because of COVID. It's got nothing to do with that pandemic, yet the emergency slush fund created as a result of that pandemic is now being used for purposes for which it wasn't intended, which is to bail out the Teamsters pensions. The government guarantees pensions. Lots of pensions are underfunded. A lot of them are going to fail, which is the reason the U.S. government is on the hook for all this money, which is why these unfunded liabilities are every bit as real as actual debt, but none of it is accounted for in the $31+ trillion national debt, because unlike private companies that do account for unfunded liabilities, the U.S. government commits accounting fraud because it completely denies the existence of any unfunded liabilities and acts as if none of those unfunded liabilities are ever going to have to be paid. Once again, investors were disappointed by a hotter than expected report on inflation. And again, it makes no sense to me that so many people expect inflation to be coming down when nothing the Federal Reserve has done thus far is equal to the task. In fact, it's not just that what the Fed has done is inadequate to reduce inflation, but the U.S. government itself has done nothing to reduce inflation. In fact, everything they've done is throw gasoline on the inflation fire, because ever since inflation became an obvious problem that people were complaining about, the only response we've had from Washington is an increase in government spending, which just compounds the inflation problem. So long as the Federal Reserve artificially suppresses interest rates by holding them below the rate of inflation, something that would never happen in a free market, but as long as this is Fed policy, it is stoking inflation's fires, not putting out the inflation. And again, it's not going to make any headway unless it has cooperation from the government. You can't have fiscal stimulus and fight inflation. You need contractionary fiscal policy married with contractionary monetary policy to reverse this process. And of course, none of it can be accomplished not only without a severe recession, but without triggering a worse financial crisis than the one that was experienced in 2008, which is why the Fed is not actually fighting inflation. Of course, it can't admit that, so it has to pretend that it's fighting inflation while it secretly continues